So are we as a nation satisfied with democracy? And unfortunately, the vast majority of South Africans are not satisfied with democracy. Satisfaction with democracy, very specifically the way democracy works, has been falling year after year for the past 10 years. It's currently at its lowest level in the last 20 years.
Wow.
Only about 1 in 5 adult South Africans say they are satisfied with the way democracy is working. The majority are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working.
Satisfaction with democracy in South Africa is at an all-time low over the last 20 years. And in fact, 1 in every 5 adults in South Africa are currently satisfied with the way things are being run. Alarmingly, 41% of adult South Africans approved of the following statement: the army comes in to govern the country. These are 2 crucial points, amongst other things, that I cover today with Senior Researcher Specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council, Stephen Gordon. If you're interested in how South Africans feel and what the nation is thinking at the moment, this episode is for you. Please like, share, subscribe, and enjoy. Stephen Gordon, welcome to the Xpect Performance podcast. Lovely to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so happy you're interested in these important topics.
Yes, so that is exactly why I had you on, because it's very interesting and it's very applicable to South Africans, especially now heading into election season. 29th of May, arguably the most important election that this country's seen since its inaugural one. But Stephen, give me a bit of your background and your research and the context for where you find yourself now, which is a senior research specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council.
So I am a public opinion scientist. So what I do is I look at public opinion survey data. Field workers go all over South Africa. They interview a representative sample of South Africans, ask them a range of questions about governance, democracy, social identity, political issues, a vast, innumerable amount of topics. And I've spent the last 10 years pouring through data like that, looking at how South Africans think and feel and behave on a range of different issues. And using that data, we're able to derive unique insights into how our country has changed, how it hasn't changed, and how people really think and feel about the most important issues that confront us as a society.
So what are the nature of the questionnaires? If you can outline some major pillars or fundamentals on what those questionnaires revolve around.
So the type of data we look at covers a huge array of subjects, from the environment to the fourth industrial revolution to education. But the main things we focus on are governance, democracy, I would say social identity, often pitched as racial identity within South African context, although we do cover some other ones, as well as attitudes towards quality of life and what makes a good and meaningful life.
Naomi Klein, she gave what I think is a fabulous quote around democracy, and it says, democracy is not just the right to vote, it's the right to live in dignity, which I think is very pertinent to where we find ourselves in as a country at the moment. Tell me, from your research, what are South Africans' attitudes towards democracy at the moment?
That is a very powerful question. So first, let's start out with satisfaction with democracy. Right? So are we as a nation satisfied with democracy? And unfortunately, the vast majority of South Africans are not satisfied with democracy. Satisfaction with democracy, very specifically the way democracy works, has been falling year after year for the past 10 years. It's currently at its lowest level in the last 20 years.
Wow.
Only about 1 in 5 adult South Africans say they are satisfied with the way democracy is working. The majority are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. And indeed, it's startling to see how low satisfaction with democracy is. The province in which satisfaction with democracy is at its lowest level is KwaZulu-Natal. Because people in KwaZulu-Natal are remarkably unhappy with the status quo and remarkably unhappy with the results that democracy delivers. And why are they unhappy with those results? They're unhappy because of something called instrumental evaluation. This is a very fancy way of saying that they are dissatisfied with the economic and service delivery conditions of the country. And they use those judgments about the economy and about service delivery to make judgments about how well democracy is functioning. If you ask people what's the most important thing for democracy, people are generally happy with the fact that there are elections, that there's free speech. What they are not happy with is the economic returns to democracy, and they're not happy with the politicians which sit in high office, who they feel do not listen to them and do not care about what's going on the ground.
Yeah. So with regards to satisfaction around democracy, is that dissatisfaction with the principle of democracy, or is it the dissatisfaction with the current implementation of democracy from our politicians?
So what we've seen happen is two things. So firstly, system legitimacy. So system legitimacy is the idea that the system you have is legitimate. So people used to feel quite strongly that democracy was the best system available. And we've seen that steadily erode over the last 5 years, falling, coming down. About 25% of the population feels that a non-democratic system could actually be better than the democracy we have now.
Wow.
1 in 5. A big chunk of the population, and it kind of goes up and down a little bit, they're very ambiguous. They say it doesn't really matter what kind of society we have, and a minority currently, one of the first times this has actually been true, thinks that democracy is the best system. So what we've seen is that dissatisfaction with the returns of democracy are starting to affect people's view of democracy as a legitimate system. So one of the other things we've seen is that we ask people, what's important for democracy? Talk about free speech, election participation, a strong opposition, etc. That has started to decline. The importance that people start ascribing to those things has fallen as people become more dissatisfied with how democracy has returned itself to us as South Africans. We have noticed in this election year, right? So in 2023, late 2023 is when we did our last survey, that there was a mild uptick in optimism about democracy because the election was drawing close, and I think people felt a sort of change in the air. Whether they will be disappointed or whether they will be vindicated in that feeling is yet to be seen, but there is a mild optimism that we've seen. But we must remember the base of pessimism is so strong that this mild uptick, it doesn't look very impressive when charted on a graph. And you see, look at that 4% difference there.
Yes.
It's like people aren't so impressed by that.
Yeah.
So it has been quite striking to look at how attitudes have changed.
Wow, I can imagine. So tell me, when you go and you conduct a survey of this magnitude to get the stats that you've got, that you've just referenced there, on what type of a scale is that happening? How many people are you speaking to? How many surveys and questionnaires are you going out into the field and receiving back to get that data to then say, okay, this is something that it is noteworthy and it's valid, and we can apply that with some kind of confidence?
Oh, absolutely. So you take census data, and census data divides the population in what they call SALs, small area layers. These are about the size of a neighborhood, and then we send field workers to that neighborhood, and then they sample at random houses within those neighborhoods. Now, not all neighborhoods in South Africa are the same. Some are villages, some are very wealthy, some are very, very poor, some are informal settlements, some are new RDP developments. So when we get our data back, right, we need to create a representative picture.
Yes.
Right, so how do we do that? We use a weighting algorithm, a very detailed and complex algorithm that weights up certain groups and weights down certain other groups to allow our picture to be representative. So for example, we might have too many women in the study. Maybe there's 55% women and only 46% men. We have to upweight our male respondents just a touch and downweight our female respondents just a touch to bring them in line with the census data. So we interview people 16 years and older to get a teenage contingent and to really speak to youth issues. And we don't try and be too prescriptive. So as long as you are physically living in South Africa and you live in a dwelling of some kind, then you're qualified to be included in the survey. And we don't just interview once, we interview every year. And so it's that build up wave after wave of data, thousands after thousands of interviews that come in that give you this overall picture of what's happening in the country. And every year we interview about 3,000 people.
Okay.
And this gives you a very strong representative stance of South Africans. Actually, our sample size is a little larger than what you would need for a truly representative sample. But we're very interested in certain smaller groups of South Africans. We have to oversample certain groups.
Okay.
This makes our sample a little superior to some of marketing samples who rely a lot on telephonic interviews, for example, which can be very biased, as well as those people who rely on online interviews collected through various online platforms like Moya Messenger, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When it comes to the questions that are actually being asked, is there significant thought and a deliberate contemplation around the words that are used? So not to, for example, use some kind of coercive language, or to try and make it as neutral a question as possible, so not to maybe skew the results or the interpretation of the questions?
So questionnaire survey design is a whole science unto itself.
Yes.
And people, not just in South Africa, but all over the world, have spent a huge amount of time perfecting the art of designing questions, using academic studies, small-scale research groups to then think what is the best way to ask a specific question, to tap into a specific construct. All questionnaires are piloted, obviously, so you can actually really see if a very specific type of question is working or not.
Okay.
Now, there are some very interesting challenges we have when we approach our South African population. So many South Africans do not have solid secondary education. So you think about Europe, the United States, we're talking about a population which almost universally has completed secondary education. South Africa, that's not true. So you have to think about language that can be asked to a relatively uneducated person. A person perhaps who doesn't have a good working knowledge of what's been in the news lately, or the kind of more sophisticated language that people who have tertiary degrees would use day to day. So often when we are working with researchers and working with policymakers, they will want to ask questions that are just too complicated to straightforwardly ask an individual. We must try and find a way to ask these questions to the respondent. So the second challenge we have is that some subjects are very sensitive. Subjects about sexual propriety, violence, for example. These can create biases in how people respond. So you have to think about ways to get at your subject while not actually asking directly the question, to find workarounds when we want to speak to something which is very, very powerful and important in South Africa, but something that people would be very, very sensitive in actually responding, that maybe this had happened to them or they're aware of this problem. There are many subjects which South Africans have a very visceral and strong reaction to.
Yes, I can imagine, especially in a country that's as diverse and multicultural as ours. So going back to what you spoke about democracy and the link to okay, let me start with this then. That you acknowledge that in your studies, people are not really over the moon about democracy as as a system of governance at the moment. Has there been any research from you and your team around then what would be an alternative form of governance?
We have done research on various authoritarian alternatives to democracy and asked people whether they would support, for example, the dismissal of parliament, the rule of South Africa by the military, that sort of thing. So there is research on that. These are one of these things I can actually look up because we have it here.
Yeah,
I could tell
by
you
all
what it is.
means, let's go for it. Look it up.
Okay, sure. Right, we asked people if they approved or disapproved of the following statement: the army comes in to govern the country. Right? So the share which disapproved of this statement was 42%. The share who approved of the statement was 41%, and the people who were kind of in the middle were about 16%. Which shows you that about almost half of the population would be fine with the military taking over, and only about half would be unhappy if the military took over.
What?
I know. And then we can...
Does that come as a shock to you? Because you must get a really good indication of the pulse of the nation and what people actually feel, and you have access to these kinds of questions and numbers and opinions on a daily basis. Does that surprise you, that response?
Not really, because what happens when you see high levels of status quo and dissatisfaction, when people are unhappy with the status quo, it creates a very, very weak center, and then outside voices can come in and then they can sweep the table.
That's where you get your populist leaders and the likes.
So if you look at Argentina, right, this guy came out of nowhere, very populist stance, swept aside the existing political parties, and now he's running Argentina. The same with Ukraine, with Bolsonaro. Brazil had that for a few years. The guy who's currently in charge of France, he came out of nowhere, new political party, rose to power. So when there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the center, new forces come in out of nowhere, can seize control. Because exactly the sort of stats that I'm reading to you now, when people are unhappy with the status quo, they're open to lots of different alternatives. Does this mean I think that the army actually will be able to mount some kind of coup? No. I just think it shows you that people are not as committed to democracy as
they once were.
Yes, exactly. So, for example, the idea that elections in parliament are abolished so that the president can decide everything. 26% of South Africans approve of that statement. Only 53% disapprove, while about a fifth are somewhere in the middle.
So only 53% disapprove
of elections and parliament being abolished and giving sole power to the president, which is, quite an interesting statement given that, the president is so unpopular right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And interesting, I took a drive through Burn Valley near Richmond over the weekend, and on one of the driving through the, if you want to call it, I suppose maybe the city centre, there's some buildings where graffiti had taken place on the wall, and it was #Free Jacob and #Free Zuma on a number of buildings driving into town. And it made me think about, and this is, I think, the value behind what you and your team do, is I watched a TED Talk with you. It was it in the Northwest?
It was in the Northwest.
Yeah, so it was in the Northwest, and you, I think it was about 2018, 2019, just before the last national elections. You outlined what was quite alarming to you in particular was the rise in opinion that violent protest action was not basically reprehensible, that it was actually on the table, and people thought that that was essentially a productive means of protest. And it left me with a little bit of a weird feeling in my tummy, because now obviously we look back in hindsight and July 2021 riots took place, and that discontent that people showed in terms of how they answered that question regarding protest action proved to be quite prophetic 2.5 years down the line. And I think that's the value behind, the work that you've done, the work that the team at the HSRC continue to do, is that you can identify trends and you can perhaps alter the course of a society productively for the better if you use those statistics correctly.
You could offer advice to the people who make decisions, and those people hopefully can take action which will meaningfully alter the way our society is progressing. Some of the work we do is for the Election Commission. The Election Commission wants to understand why voter turnout has fallen over the last 10 years, and what can be done to encourage people to vote. We provide them with lots of advice in this area, but fundamentally, it's a little bit out of their hands. The issue that people have with elections is not so much that they're unhappy with long lines, or they're dissatisfied with the ballot paper, or they don't think the polling workers are very courteous to them. The issue they have is the names on the ballots. They are not happy with the names they see when they look at their ballot paper. They are dissatisfied with the political class. They are dissatisfied with the political parties. They are dissatisfied with politicians. Now, one of the problems we have with South African democracy is that people don't take that dissatisfaction and then try and find an alternative to vote for. They would prefer to stay home. Right? So it would be better for our democracy if people engaged in a voting process which attempted to better hold office makers accountable for their decisions and the dissatisfaction of the general populace. But unfortunately, many people do see their votes as a kind of reward for policymakers doing a good job, which doesn't always contribute to holding policymakers accountable. If you stay home on election day, you haven't actually changed the election result because you're staying home.
Yes.
If you went out and voted for someone you thought would do a better job, then that might do the trick. But a lot of people, unfortunately, they don't view democracy in that fashion. And one of the questions we ask people is, if the political party you traditionally supported disappointed you, what would you do? And only a minority of people say that they would switch their vote to someone else. Most people will tell you that they'll stay loyal to the party that they've always supported.
Do you have the numbers around that?
I can, hold on.
So
I can
what percentage of people would change their vote, and what percentage of people would continue to vote for the party that hasn't held up their end of the bargain, if you will?
So the exact question is, if the party you voted for did not meet your expectations, what would you do? And about 21% said they would vote for another party. 27% said that they would not vote. 35% would give the party another chance. 10% would wait for an explanation from the party they traditionally voted for.
Okay, so the majority would give the party another chance.
Yeah. It's a slim majority.
Slim majority,
yes. So, but only a minority would actually switch their vote to someone else, which is unfortunately not the way you change political outcomes if that's what you're looking to do.
Yes, that's fair enough, I would say. So we chatted off air about many things, but going back to democracy, and then what one might call the antithesis of democracy, which would be what we experienced as state capture. What is the research, and what is the idea and the feelings amongst the South African people regarding state capture?
It's very, very interesting. We did work for the Zondo Commission on this very subject. So we must remember that a lot of South Africans are not very keen on following the news and are not very tuned in to the political events of our country. So despite the fact that Xpect and the Zondo Commission were in the news every day for years, only about half of the adult population had heard of the term Xpect or heard of the term Zondo Commission. So those people who had heard of these things, they felt that Xpect had done great damage to our economy and to our democracy as a whole. When it came to judgments about the Zondo Commission itself, the population was more varied. Many people were concerned that the Zondo Commission had not produced the results that they were looking for. So they were looking for prosecutions, jail time.
Yes.
They wanted, heads on spikes, as it were. And, the slow grinding process of the judiciary seemed unsatisfactory to many people. Although many people were quite supportive of the Zondo Commission, there was a solid block of people who felt the Zondo Commission was doing a very, very good job.
Okay.
When it comes to Jacob Zuma, who of course is at the heart of Xpect, the majority of the population do not trust Jacob Zuma. Particularly the level of trust afforded to Zuma dropped immediately after he stopped being ANC president, and he lost the brand recognition that title comes with. The only place where his trust levels were relatively high was here in KwaZulu-Natal. In the rest of the country, he is viewed with great distrust. Indeed, it kind of speaks to his connection with the Zulu majority here in KZN, that MK seems to be doing quite well in KZN, but not seem to be making much of a difference elsewhere.
Yeah, in the polls, yeah, 100%. That's fascinating, hey? It's such a, there's a lot going on in this country, especially at this time of year and where we find ourselves now in this moment in time. But history provides context for much of what we are experiencing at the moment. And if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going, right? So tell me about the research and some interesting stats that have come out of South Africans' understanding of our history and maybe how that's impacting where we find ourselves today.
So unfortunately, South Africans, when you ask them about history, they are very proud of South African history. So you ask them, are you proud of South African history? Vast majority of people, yes, I am proud. But when you actually start digging a little deeper into that, you find that they don't know that much history. So in South Africa, we have accorded certain days the status of public holiday. And those days correspond to key moments in the anti-apartheid struggle. And despite the importance of the anti-apartheid struggle for our democracy and for the vast majority of South Africans, if you ask them, can you explain to us what the Sharpeville massacre is or the Soweto uprising, they will tell you that they don't know what that is. And that's very, very concerning. It's especially true of younger people. If you ask people, do you agree or disagree that history is not important and we should stop talking about the past? They tend to agree with that statement.
To stop talking about the past.
There is a feeling that South Africans want to move forward, and constant references to the past seem unimportant to them and the struggles that they're going through now. Indeed, what we notice when we do our research is South Africans like to use the past as a rhetorical tool to make arguments. So frequently you'll hear, things were better during apartheid, for example, in a rhetorical stance to try and advocate against load shedding or potholes, or crime levels, or the conditions at hospitals, or the conditions at schools. What is happening here is that South Africans are not making an objective judgment about apartheid and democracy. They're sharply indicating their deep frustration with the status quo, and they're feeling that their expectations have not been met, which is often behind many of the statements that people make when they say nothing has changed.
Yes.
I mean, one studies, the economy, society, geography. One finds there's been massive change. The labor market has changed, cities have changed, people's lives have changed, people's political realities have fundamentally changed. What is not the problem is the expectations that people had of democracy. Those have not lived up to the returns of democracy. The change that has often happened in people's lives is not as positive as they would have liked. And in many ways, things have happened that have made people very disillusioned and unhappy. And that is a real thing. You know, the president, he gave a speech recently full of, statistics about the economy, job creation, etc. And many people were unhappy with this speech because he was saying things were better now than the past, and that they don't feel that way. Not that he was wrong in his assessment, but again, people's expectations of what their lives should be and the reality of their lives are just too different, and this makes them deeply unhappy.
Yes. So speaking about South Africans, I get involved in this particular question that I'm going to ask you quite a lot, and it's quite pertinent, especially people our age. I think if I had to put my neck out and hazard a guess, I would say South Africans between the age of maybe 20 and, let's say for arguments, let's say between 20 and 40, particularly white South Africans, are inclined to, at some point during this infancy of their professional careers, look to go overseas, look to find work elsewhere, or at least explore those potential opportunities. And with that comes an identity crisis, because one might feel, okay, I'm moving overseas, let's say I move to England. Do I belong? Is that really my homeland, my motherland? Is that really where I'm from? Am I truly a South African? In some ways, there's policies that are making it difficult for white South Africans to feel South African because they're being pushed down the pecking order for a number of reasons. And then you might go overseas, and then everybody might speak the same mother language, and there's no prejudice for you to get a job or to get a qualification or to get into university. With that comes an identity crisis. Where do we sit? Have you done any research on how South Africans feel about their identity as South Africans and what that identity might resemble?
There's been a lot of research on that very important question. So let's start with one of the key issues. So feeling discriminated against, right, which I knew you touched on. So what's interesting is that all South Africans feel discriminated against.
Yes.
Black South Africans feel very discriminated against. Indian South Africans feel very discriminated against. Colored South Africans feel very discriminated against. White South Africans feel very discriminated against. And they feel discriminated against because of their racial identity. And we ask them, do you feel discriminated against because of your racial identity? And they say, yes, I do feel discriminated against because of my racial identity. They also feel that their racial group as a whole is discriminated against.
This is across the board.
This is all across the different racial groups. So there's 4 big racial groups: white, black African, colored, and Indian. They all feel racially discriminated. The people who feel the most racially discriminated are Indian South Africans, interestingly enough.
Really?
Yeah.
That is interesting.
And so this produces a deep frustration amongst the general population. And when a person moves between their social circles, which are comprised of different racial groups, one, of course, really gets a sense of this. You spend time with racial group A and they talk about how unfairly they are discriminated against by the system. And then you go to racial group B and they also feel deeply discriminated against by the system. And I think this causes a lot of South Africans a lot of psychological pain.
Yes.
And unfortunately, this is one of those indicators that hasn't really changed a lot in the last 15 years. It's remained very stable, moves up and down a little bit, depending on, to be honest, what's in the news. Sometimes there's a specific racial event that makes people particularly sensitive towards this issue, and sometimes there isn't. But on general, en masse, people feel that they are discriminated against. One of the issues we have with pride in South Africa is that people will tell you that they're very proud to be South African. Just like they'll tell you they're proud, like if you go to other countries, you go to the UK, you go to Germany, you go to Saudi Arabia and you ask people, are you proud to be Saudi Arabia? They'll tell you they're proud. This is a very universal thing. People are proud of their nation. If it comes to South Africans, unfortunately, there are certain issues in which South Africans are not proud. So they're not proud with the way the economy works. They're not proud with the way democracy works. And so these are not sources of pride for the general population. When it comes to a larger issue of an identity crisis, I definitely feel that many South Africans struggle with their identity. Just to touch on racial identity, which is very important to South Africans. If you ask people, is your racial identity important to you? Vast majority, over 80%, will tell you, yes, my racial identity is important to me. They will also tell you that they feel somewhat ashamed of some of the things that their racial group has done. And that's true of all South Africans. It's about, I think it's about two-thirds, three-fifths.
Yeah.
Feel that their racial group has done things that they're ashamed of.
Okay.
So I think people have a very complex but very strong, very powerful racial identity, and the racial identity is often a racial identity that they feel is persecuted against. And this causes, I think, a lot of animosity in South Africa.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, because if everybody feels like they're discriminated against, where do we begin? You know, where does one start? I don't know. That's a very complex problem to try and solve, isn't it?
And I don't think that we as a society are really doing a very good job at trying to solve this problem. This is an issue that South Africans care a lot about. You ask them, and they will tell you in very strong terms, you know, their racial identity, their cultural or social identity is very, very important to them. And yet, we as a society don't do a lot to try and address that. There is a lot of work on economic development and addressing economic inequalities. But despite 30 years of such programs, you know, we find ourselves where the majority feels that they are still discriminated against, that they still don't have what they expect to have, that they feel denied what they should have, that they look out across the sea at other countries and they feel that they're doing a better job in terms of giving people what they expect to have, what they should have, rewarding people for their skills and talents and treating people equally. Unfortunately, in South Africa, many people feel that they are not treated equally across the board. You know, black, white, colored, Indian. There's a feeling that we are not treated as equal citizens.
Stephen, let's finish with this. Is there some recent research that's come across your desk that leaves you feeling optimistic about the future of us as South Africans?
You know, there is actually something that I never really get the chance to talk about, so I'm going to talk about it here. So, almost 20 years ago, South Africa passed very progressive, I'm going to say, sexual minority legislation that granted a series of rights to sexual minorities, people who are gay, people who are lesbian, people who are transgender. And at the time, such measures were very unpopular. There's a lot of animosity towards this group, particularly gay and lesbian people. What we've seen of the last 15 years is South Africans have become less prejudiced towards the gay and lesbian community. They've become more welcoming, more accepting. There still is too much prejudice against this community, but every year we can see an opening of hearts and minds on this very important issue. We have not seen similar things in other African countries where animosity, hatred, and persecution remain very high. But in South Africa, we've made real, meaningful progress on that issue.
Wow.
So good things are possible as long as people, put in the time and effort. And it really goes to those activists working tirelessly, particularly in the early 2000s, late 1990s, when all the world was against them. And anyone they mentioned this topic to reacted with disgust and disdain. Now they can look across a national landscape which is increasingly becoming much more progressive and much more tolerant on this important issue.
Fantastic. I love that we've ended it on a positive note. Stephen, where can people find you if they want to follow your research in particular and the research that happens at the Human Sciences Research Council?
I don't have a big social media following. I'm on LinkedIn.
Yes. You've got a great LinkedIn profile.
I'm on LinkedIn. I have I've written lots of articles if people are interested. We do a lot of press. Please follow me on LinkedIn. The HSRC has a website. Unfortunately, it's going through some design challenges right now, but I'm sure improvements are on the way. And I encourage everyone who's interested in these topics to please look us up and engage with these important research questions.
Wonderful. Stephen, thank you for being here and thanks for everything that you do.
It's very kind of you to invite me, and thanks for this very interesting discussion. I always like engaging in very important topics, and it was very nice to be able to discuss a wide range of things with you, even though some of them were a bit depressing.
Not so fast. It's a new year, which means it's a new outro. And let me level with you. It is such a cool feeling when I see that Spotify subscribers number increase on the weekly, when I see the number of people listening to the episodes going up. And it really makes a huge difference. Have you ever done something and you feel so good when you get rewarded by some positive feedback and you really feel like you're making a difference? That's what it means to me, and that's how I feel. And it goes a long way if you like the show, share it and subscribe it. Thank you humbly, and I'll see you next week.